Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Purging Kiev, or the revolution eats its own children. On the back of an economic meltdown and defeat on the battlefield, there are signs the Maidan revolutionaries are turning on each other. Walking away from the Minsk ceasefire process, the Kiev regime is looking desperate. Is more war their only option? To CrossTalk, the civil war in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander McCurris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. Also in London, we have Charles Shoebridge. He is a security analyst and former British Army officer. And in Washington, we cross to Anton Fedoshin. He is a professor of Russian history at the American University. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, if I can go to you first, this program has its genesis in something that you wrote on Facebook about the changing nature of the regime in Kiev. Essentially, is there a purge going on or a reshuffle? I don't like Sovietology, criminology. You pointed that out in your piece, and I appreciate it. But there are changes coming about there.
It would appear so. A few weeks ago, Mr. Kolomoisky, who was a very powerful figure in the Ukrainian political system, he was the governor of Dnipropetrovsk, was basically forced to resign. I mean, he didn't really resign, he was removed. There's been increasing talk that Mr. Yatsenyuk, who is the prime minister and who is the leader of the largest party in the Ukrainian parliament, alongside that of the president, Mr. Poroshenko, that Mr. Yatsenyuk may also be on his way out. Certainly there are people within the political leadership who seem to be talking that way. And we've also seen this rather interesting promotion of Mr. Yarosh, the leader of Right Sector, one of the paramilitary groups, who's been brought in as an advisor of the Defense Ministry, which seems to be an attempt to bring him on side whilst this purge continues. And at the same time, there's been growing investigations of certain of the voluntary battalions that were formerly connected to Mr. Kolomoisky, and possibly through Mr. Kolomoisky to Mr. Yatsenyuk as well. People looking especially at the work of the Aidar battalion, which is one of these very dangerous right-wing battalions that have been involved in the fighting in the East. You know,
Anton, if I can go to you in Washington, this often happens in revolutionary groups, is that when their goals cannot be immediately achieved, they start turning in on themselves here. And we have Mr. Yatsenyuk, as Alexander pointed out. We have to make it really say the obvious here. He is the favorite, if I can use that term. I would use a different term, but this is television, the favorite of someone like Victoria Nuland in the United States. I mean, what kind of volatility do we have here? There are external forces in play here, bringing, keeping people in power and maybe pushing others out. What's your read?
Well, absolutely, and that's the key issue for Ukraine are the outside forces and the pressure that, of course, Moscow and Brussels and Washington are applying to the situation. It's unfortunate that what is essentially a civil war and a conflict within Ukraine has become internationalized. But the remarkable thing about Washington is that just like Moscow should not be treated as a black box, neither should Washington. And yes, there is a war party in the city, but we've seen over the past month, roughly, the White House taking some very cautious and remarkably level-headed decisions about Ukraine, specifically about preventing the supply of weapons, which would have made the situation much worse. So we'll see where this will go, but so far it looks like the peace is holding, and we'll see how this will sort of unfold in Ukraine itself. What we have noticed so far is that the approval ratings of the Ukrainian politicians have plummeted as a result of the end of hostilities, and that is a very bad sign for both Yatsenyuk and Poroshenko. Okay, I'm glad you brought up a number here. Just as I was coming to the studio here, I looked at some public opinion polls. If I can go to Charles in London, title of it, 93% of Donbass civilians
civilians, say, alienated from Kiev forever. Isn't this really the issue that we really should be talking about here? Poroshenko came out a few days ago saying that federalization is not popular in Ukraine. The majority are against it. He doesn't want to test it with a vote. I wonder why. But the fact of the matter is, this is really what the Kiev regime should be doing, should be actually talking to these people if they want to keep the country in one piece, which I think is the best idea for all involved at the end of the day. Go ahead.
Yes, and that's exactly, if you like, if not the word, and it arguably is the word, but it's especially the spirit of the Minsk agreement. First of all, that the territorial integrity, shall we say, of the unitary body of Ukraine is going to be respected. Let's take Crimea, for example, is now out of that position. In fact, it's not even a subject of discussion anymore. So removing Crimea as an issue means that really the territorial integrity of Ukraine is something that pretty much most parties, and certainly the external parties that we've already spoken about, are essentially committed to. And of course, the Ukraine government is committed to that. And indeed, it's still the case that many people within even Donbass do not seek, for example, to be leaving Ukraine, as opposed to having far more independence within a federal system. The earlier speaker, I think it's Alexander, mentioned that, Anton, the effects of the war coming to an end. And this is a very crucial position here, because what we're seeing, I think, within Kiev and within the government and the influential external, shall we say, sources of influence of power, we're talking about, for example, the militias, is a jostling of position in a post-war environment. Yep. Whilst the war has been going on, I've got contacts on both sides within Ukraine and have visited much of the area, is that the war has provided a unifying factor. It's performed this unifying function within those who are in the west and the center of Ukraine against those in the east. That has allowed the Kiev government to gloss over, paper over the cracks that are within its own composition, the different power struggles and so on. As soon as the war is finished, if it does indeed finish, and we're already seeing some positive signs in that, then those disputes are increasingly going to come out into the open. And I think it's for that situation now that people are jostling for power, particularly Poroshenko, who, of course, may be more threatened than anybody else by the situation in terms of economy and the handling of the war.
I agree with you. Alexander, if I can go back to you in London, I mean, when you have Yarosh and Parubi jostling for power there, I find that to be extremely disturbing, because these people do not think in terms. And again, you know, for our audience here, and I'm going to get, you know, a lot of people disagree when I say this, but these are people that could easily be called neo-fascist. They're certainly ultra-nationalists. They're bigoted in many different ways. Just look them up. That's what I say to people that criticize me all the time. Look it up. Now, Alexander here, I mean, these people are not concerned with the economy. They're not concerned with inflation. They're not concerned with pensions. They're not concerned with groceries. They're not concerned with clean roads and playgrounds. You know what they're interested in. They want more war. They're jostling for power. They're very close to the center. Poroshenko has always been an unknown quantity. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
No, I'm afraid pessimistic, and I think all the points which you made, with which I, by the way, completely agree, show why. And if I can also come back to a couple of the points Charles was making. One of the great problems with this regime is that it is highly factionalized. I mean, the regime in Kiev. And the moment we have peace, we see that these problems of factionalism start to rise to the surface. The one thing that gives this regime a degree of internal unity and coherence is war. And that in itself is a reason, therefore, for it to go for war. It is a mobilization regime, yes. And a mobilization regime requires conflict. Now, that reason in itself is a good reason to doubt that this peace agreement can hold. And I'm afraid you're also absolutely right that with the rise of influence of people like Mr. Yarosh, now an advisor in the Defense Ministry, his vision is for a unitary monolingual, monoethnic Ukraine. That is what he is concerned about. He will not want a peace if that is compromised. And he is a very powerful figure in Ukrainian politics, has been ever since the Maidan events in February 2014, and he is becoming increasingly stronger.
And we've seen we have the sanctions coming up for renewal or not renewal by the Europeans. Unfortunately, the Americans have to vote one way or another. They're in a real bind there. Or as a good friend of mine has pointed out to me, the sanctions from America will stay forever. The Europeans will most likely lift them because they're seeing, again, everything that we've said on this program, the cracks inside this regime, and they're quite unsavory, and most of their solutions are not solutions, are not answers the EU really wants to go down the road with.
That's right. Ultimately, the Ukraine story is about economics. This is something that Alexander just brought up. It is ultimately about economics, and I cannot stress that enough. It's something that I've been saying for a year in all of the interviews that I have done. What we have just lived through, or the Ukrainians have lived through, is a tragic and catastrophic sideshow. The real story is economics, and the sanctions against Russia have done absolutely nothing to help the Ukrainians solve the basic problem that got Ukraine into this mess, which was not created in 2013 or 14, but has been building up ever since Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union for 25 years. That's a whole generation now. And ultimately, this problem will not be solved without Russia's direct involvement, because Russia is the largest single lender to Ukraine. It is the largest single country trading partner of Ukraine, and so much of Ukrainian industry and banks are tied to Russia, for better or for worse. So the way out of this mess that we are in is through economics. And the faster the United States, the Europeans, and the Russians will sit down at the table with the Ukrainians to solve this problem, the better. And this is exactly what the Russians have proposed in November of 2013.
We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with our team. Okay, Charles, I'd like to go back to you in London. I think what Anton said right before we went to the break makes a lot of sense here. You really can't fight a war of this kind with the economy that's in free fall, which is essentially what has happened to Ukraine here. One of the wild cards in my mind has always been the difference between how the Europeans and the Americans approach this. We've heard a lot of tough talk coming out of Washington, but not a whole lot of action, thankfully. That's my opinion. We don't need any more weapons right there. Do you think that the Americans are taking a step back and taking a breath and saying, you know, we can't help them fix their economy while they're fighting a war? And the Russians have been very clear in their position from the very start of this conflict and what their red lines are. So a step back, a breath to take in Washington?
I think we have to remember that in Ukraine, as indeed in other theatres, for example, even in the Far East, Syria is another good example, Libya arguably as well, that American foreign policy is never, if you like, a coherent beast. American foreign policy, of course, is always subject to different pressure, lobby and interest groups in Washington and elsewhere. And at different times, foreign policy is in a state of flux between the varying, shall we say, advantages and disadvantages, the varying degrees of influence of those lobby groups. We see that with Iran and so on. And that's certainly the case with Ukraine, where you've got, to some degree, you've got, and we all know that the people that we're talking about here, the McCains and others, who see the Ukrainian situation as a way of, if you like, attacking Russia, as a way of reviving old Cold War enmities, and people who may even genuinely feel that actually Russia is a serious threat to the United States and to the West, and therefore they pose it in those terms. And of course, they get backing from the US media in that respect. On the other hand, on the other side of that equation, you've got Obama, who I think is increasingly, especially as his term in office comes to an end, he's taking a more conciliatory line. I don't think he wants to be responsible as his legacy for ongoing conflicts and even worse, a conflict in Europe. And it's in that context that we see the big difference, of course, between the emphasis of countries such as France and Germany, not all European countries, because of course Britain is very much on the side of the United States, as in most things, also in the situation in regards to Ukraine. But you've got countries like France and Germany absolutely aghast at the prospect of America or Britain or anybody pumping more arms into what's already a volatile situation. They can see further down the line that if that is what was going to happen, of course, Russia may well then be tempted to increase supply of arms if that's what's happening to the rebels, and you would get a spiral of violence increasing into a conflagration. I can't even say that word at the moment, but certainly into a war that would, excuse my, it's not even French, but excuse my language there.
Go ahead.
But certainly a bad situation, we can say, that would get even worse. The situation in eastern Ukraine is bad enough from a humanitarian perspective. But France and Germany and other countries, particularly in the centre of Europe, terrified, of course, that American policy, certainly those who want to send in arms, that are backing Poroshenko and his so-called anti-terror operation unreservedly, without any shall we say, motivation for him with such backing to seek peace as opposed to victory, as it was only a few weeks ago, then that could drive a situation which could create something like a Syria-type situation in the middle of Europe. And nobody in Europe actually wants that. And so therefore we do have that difference between the two sides. Also, I think America, being further away, can pursue its interests far more single-mindedly, shall we say, and that's what it's been trying to do. We saw that, you mentioned about Newland earlier, and we can see there that that's been what's been happening with Ukraine up to now. Of course, with this shift of power between the different factions in Kiev, it's going to be very interesting to see how that turns out, bearing in mind that Yatsenuk was always our man, as Washington put it, in Kiev. And, of course, that isn't quite working out the way that the Americans hoped it would do. And, of course, the Europeans, particularly France and Germany, are exercising their own weight to say that America isn't going to have the only say in what goes on in Europe, particularly when it's going to be to the detriment of Western and Central Europe.
Okay, Alexander, one of the interesting things in Western... Go ahead, jump in real quick. Go ahead. Yep.
Very quickly, Peter, let me just add to what Charles has said. Economics is a very important aspect of this, and Europe is a lot more integrated with Russia economically than the United States is, and that is a very important factor here.
You know, Alexander, one of the things that Western media always seems to drop out in what's happening here, because there is other interested parties. Russia is a very interested party. Ukraine is its neighbor. There are millions of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. They, of course, have an interest in what's going on there. But the interesting thing is that, you know, we talk about the different positions of Brussels and maybe London and Washington. But you know what? The position in Moscow has only gotten solidified. There's public opinion behind the president very strongly. This is an issue. It is visceral with Russians. How dare they do this to us, to those people in Ukraine, when it was never necessary in the first place? This is an invented crisis coming out of the West here, and people are backing the president. Hey, Russia right now is having difficult economic times, but that's not hurting the public opinion ratings of the government and of Mr. Putin here. This is something the West never calculated on.
Well, it didn't calculate it on it. And if I can explain a point that, going back to something that Anton said, Anton talked about the economics, and he's absolutely right about the importance of the economics. The economics are the reality. What we have seen in Ukraine and in the West over the course of the Ukrainian conflict is not a diversion. It is a flight from reality about Ukraine, about its economic situation, and about its multi-ethnic nature, and a flight of reality about Russia, about Russia's relation to Ukraine, and about the nature of Russian society and how it would respond to what has happened in Ukraine, a country with which Russians are very familiar and which, as you absolutely rightly said, Peter, I remember you saying this about a year ago, for Russians, Ukraine is not just any foreign country. It is a country to which they are bound in the most intimate way. They when they hear people in Ukraine speak, they hear them talking in the same language as them, they go to the same churches as they do, they have the same culture as they have. For Russians, Ukraine matters in a way that it can never matter to people in the West, and Russians will always understand the realities of Ukraine far better than they have been understood in the West up to now.
You know, Charles, I covered, it was before CrossTalk came on air, but I covered very extensively the Orange Revolution and all the events that followed there, Yushchenko and the breakup of the coalition and all that. And I met quite a few very smart people that I didn't always agree with, but really smart people about Ukraine. And we would discuss how delicate the country is and the delicate balance between different ethnic groups and different cultural approaches. You know, and it was all in good faith, sitting around the table and talking about it. And then, you know, I see these people, the American ambassador in Kiev and Victoria Nuland, and did they read any of this literature? Did they talk to any smart people at all about this country? Because, you know, it was very easy to tip over the apple cart, as it were, and all of the apples went in ways and places they never expected.
No, that's absolutely right. And anybody that knows Ukraine, and I myself have got, you know, I've known it for around 10 years, visited a very great deal of it on East and West and South. And you get an impression of a complex society of different, as you say, different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Of course, there are two that predominate, the Ukraine and the Russian shall we say, origins or histories or traditions, perhaps better put, and their complexities within themselves. Of course, the overlap between ethnicity and language, which isn't clear-cut either. And indeed, you can go to other parts of Ukraine, and there are many other ethnicities as well. For example, if you go down to the Odessa region, Bulgarians are quite, not predominant, but very numerous as well. And so one wonders really whether, for example, look at the West with the Iraq war, whether there were many people who were warning against these actions, like an invasion of Iraq. There were specialists, people who knew about the region, but their voices were ignored because policymakers only hear what they want to hear, what is going to, if you like, reinforce their narrative. And their narrative was of Yanukovych as a dictator, notwithstanding that he was elected in what, for example, the OSCE called the fairest election since independence in Ukraine, notwithstanding what the divisions would cause as a result, notwithstanding the absolutely clear indications in the closing days of the Maidan demonstrations and riots about the nature of many of the people who were taking part in those demonstrations, not in the early days, but certainly the later days when Yanukovych was overthrown. These were all warning signs, red flags that the West chose to ignore, not just the governments, the media as well. What you've got, I think, I want to come back as well, if you don't mind as well, to this economy issue. Yeah. It's absolutely right that for most people outside, let's say, Luhansk, Donetsk, maybe Kharkiv, most of Ukraine is not directly affected by the war, apart from through their pockets, and of course through, in some areas, particularly in the West, where people are joining these volunteer battalions and the army to some degree, and of course are suffering losses as a result of that. So people all over Ukraine are suffering as a result of the war, but only in the East are they really directly suffering. For most people, the main problem is going to be the economy, which has got significantly worse under this government in the last year, even worse than it was. But secondly, people had a lot of hope and faith in the Maidan, in the West and centre and elsewhere of Ukraine, that they would sort out the biggest socio-political economic problems in terms of the inequalities and injustice of Ukraine economic life, particularly in respect of the power and influence of the oligarchs. And again, this is a situation that has not been changed by this new government. And I think this is causing problems and anxieties within the general population along with the economy, all of which will threaten the position of Kiev.
Let me go to Anton here, just close off the program here. Anton, the economy is, you know, it's the economy, stupid, it's a great phrase, but is this a way, possibly, if cooler heads prevail, to start winding this conflict down?
Absolutely. Listen, the conflict, continuing the conflict is first and foremost not in Kiev's interest because IMF money depends on peace in the country holding.
Good point.
Number two, there is no way that Ukraine is going to come back together as a sovereign state, which is what the Russians also want it to remain, without it solving its economic problems. And there are massive economic problems, and Russia has to be part of the solution, along with Ukraine, along, obviously, with the US and with Europe. This has to be dealt with at the table, which is exactly what the Russians suggested in November of 2013.
Absolutely right.
When the EU association issue came up to begin with. Putin said, tripartite talks, let's sit down, figure out how to deal with Ukraine. And after a year of tragedy and catastrophe, it looks like we're going to come back to the exact same point.
Okay, on that point there, and I say we should fire the neocons in Washington. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.